Have you ever wondered what it's like to wake up when the temperature in your house is the same as outside, and instead of a soft mattress, you're lying on a pile of dry leaves? We're used to seeing cozy cabins with cheerfully crackling fires and westerns, but the reality of the pioneers' nighttime rest was far from romantic. Sleeping on the frontier was not just rest, but a daily battle to stay warm and healthy in conditions of absolute wilderness. It was an era when comfort was measured not by the softness of a featherbed, but by the absence of drafts and the dryness of the earthen floor. People went to bed without taking off their clothes and covered themselves with whatever they could find, from bison skins to old coats. Every night was a test of endurance, where the main enemies were cold, dampness, and hard boards. Watch the video to the end to find out how ordinary corn husks became the most coveted luxury item and why rope was the main element of the bedroom. What if I told you that everything you believed about the romance of the early settlers was not true? When a pioneer family first arrived on their plot of land, there was no house there yet, and they had to sleep literally under the open sky. The first nights were spent in wagons, where the space was crammed with tools, supplies, and furniture, leaving only narrow gaps for people. Those who didn't have enough room in the wagon spread their beds right on the ground, placing fir branches or dry grass underneath themselves. This provided at least some insulation from the damp soil, which drew heat from the body at an alarming rate. When it rained, people stretched oiled tarpaulins between trees or wagon wheels, creating temporary shelter from the water. The ground beneath the sleepers was uneven, full of stones and roots that dug into their sides even through layers of blankets. The settlers quickly learned to dig small depressions for their hips and shoulders to even out the surface a little. In the morning, people woke up with stiff muscles and aching bones, but there was no time to complain because they had to build permanent housing. Even after the walls were erected, many continued to sleep on the earthen floor until it was possible to lay flooring. The earthen floor in the hut was tamped down to the hardness of stone, watered and compacted with heavy logs. In winter, such a floor became icy, and the cold penetrated through any bedding, forcing the inhabitants to huddle together. To keep warm, people used stones heated by the fire, wrapping them in cloth and placing them at their feet. Sleeping places were arranged as close as possible to the hearth, which was the only source of heat in the log cabin, which was exposed to all the winds. However, being too close to the fire posed a risk of sparks that could burn precious blankets. Often, the whole family slept huddled together on one large bedding to keep each other warm. Clothes were not usually taken off at night, as they served as an extra layer of protection against the bitter cold. People only took off their shoes, which were often used as pillows under their heads to prevent them from being stolen or getting wet. The morning awakening began with breaking the ice in a bucket of water to wash. In such conditions, the concept of personal space was completely absent, and sleep was a collective activity. Gradually, as life became more settled, rough boards replaced the earthen floor, which seemed like incredible progress. The wooden floor raised the sleepers above ground level, protecting them from direct dampness and dirt. The gaps between the boards were often so wide that cold air from under the floor came through them. These gaps were plugged with moss, clay, or old rags to keep at least some of the heat inside the room. But even with a plank floor, sleeping on hard wood was a challenge that required habit and endurance. The first beds did not appear immediately, and for many months people spent their nights on hard surfaces. The whole life of the family revolved around preparing for sleep, which was supposed to restore strength for hard work. The lack of normal rest quickly affected health, making the settlers vulnerable to disease. Fatigue accumulated, turning people into old men before their time, but they continued to stubbornly improve their lives. Every improvement in their sleeping arrangements, whether it was an extra armful of hay or an extra blanket, was seen as a victory. We would be very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about people's ability to adapt to such harsh sleeping conditions? Write about it in the comments. Are you ready to learn the truth about what the first furniture in the Wild West looked like? The most common type of sleeping place in early log cabins was the so-called one-legged bed. This design was a real lifesaver for settlers who lived in conditions of scarcity of wood, tools, and time. It allowed them to create a comfortable place to sleep with literally a minimal set of materials that were at hand. The bed was built right into the corner of the house, which saved space in the small area. The settler used two walls of the log cabin as a natural support and reinforced the structure with a single massive log or post that served as the only leg. The walls of the hut were marked in advance with the places where the bed base was to be held. Using a simple hand drill or a homemade drill, deep holes were made, which became the support points for the entire structure. Strong poles were driven into these holes to serve as guide beams. Their free ends converged on that very single leg, creating a rigid and stable frame. The structure became part of the building as it was connected to the log cabin itself. The bed could not be moved, dismantled, or relocated. It became an element of architecture and could serve for decades. Cross slats were laid on the assembled frame, providing a solid base for the future mattress. If the house had good ropes, the settlers stretched them crosswise, creating a springy mesh. This base made sleep noticeably softer, especially after a long day's work. Over time, the ropes began to stretch and sag from constant use, turning the bed into something resembling a hammock. To restore rigidity and elasticity, a special wooden peg was used to tighten the weakened knots. It was from this procedure that the expression "spikerzimko," tightly, was born, meaning well and tightly stretched ropes. If there were no suitable ropes, the settlers resorted to other materials that could be found on the prairie. They often took split boards left over from the construction of a hut and laid them tightly together. Another common option was a braid made of strips of rawhide bison skin, which was highly durable. However, the dried leather became stiff and could even crackle under the sleeper's body. The space under the bed was never left empty, as every inch of the hut was valuable. Clothes, provisions, or tools were stored there, and the bed was raised higher to protect against the cold floor. Sometimes these beds were made extra wide so that the whole family could fit together, especially on cold nights. Sleeping close together helped to keep warm, which was important in the harsh climate of the prairies. But this caused difficulties when someone tossed and turned, as the hard base amplified any movement. The wood used to make the frame was almost never carefully finished, as the settlers did not have the extra tools or time. The surface had axe marks, unevenness, and bark, which gave the bed a rough and primitive look. To avoid splinters, the owners later sanded the wood with sand or stone. Wealthier families could afford to decorate their beds with carved elements, giving them a neater and more beautiful appearance. This was considered a sign of wealth, as it required extra hours of work and good carpentry skills. However, for most settlers, reliability was more important than decoration. The bed had to withstand heavy mattresses, several adults, and constant use. It was almost impossible to destroy such a structure, as its strength was ensured by the walls of the house themselves. It became a symbol of stability, showing that the family intended to live there for a long time. There was rarely room for guests on a stationary bed in small huts, even if the guest was a relative. Travelers were usually accommodated on the floor by the hearth, where it was warmer and softer thanks to animal skins. The one-legged bed always belonged to the owners of the house or the older members of the family, as they needed rest more than others. It was the center of home comfort and the only place where one could rest relatively comfortably. Building such a bed was one of the first tasks for a man after completing the roof and walls. In the next chapter, you will learn what was used to stuff mattresses to turn these hard boards into something resembling a feather bed. Want to know a secret that will change your idea of comfort? The wooden bed frame itself was just a hard frame that could not give the body rest without a soft layer on top. Therefore, the settlers came up with the idea of using teak, a large, dense bag that became the basis for the future mattress. It was sewn from durable teak or canvas, as these fabrics could withstand enormous loads and would not tear under the weight of people. A convenient opening was left in the center through which the bag was stuffed with natural materials. The filling was chosen depending on the season, the availability of raw materials, and what was best suited to the local climate. The most popular filling material was corn husks, which could be collected in large quantities after the harvest. Women and teenagers sorted through the leaves, discarding any that were dirty or damp, as moisture could lead to mold growth. The clean husks were torn into narrow strips to make them softer and easier to distribute inside the tick. Such a mattress was surprisingly light, but it had a characteristic feature. It rustled loudly with every movement. For many pioneers, this sound became so familiar that they later considered silent beds to be unnatural. The rustling of corn literally became part of the culture of frontier life. The corn mattress required daily care. Otherwise, it quickly lost its shape and became uncomfortable. Every morning, the hostess would stick her hands into the crack in the box spring and thoroughly fluff up the contents. This helped to loosen the compacted husk and restore the mattress to its former elasticity. If this was neglected for even a week, the filling would clump together into dense lumps that pressed against the back and interfered with normal sleep. Once a year, usually after the new harvest, the old husks were poured out, the bag was dried, and it was refilled with fresh material. This was an important part of hygiene, allowing dust, debris, and insects that could appear inside to be removed. In northern regions where corn hardly grew, people had to be inventive. There, moss, dry fern leaves, or ordinary hay harvested in advance were used. Hay was considered soft, but it turned to dust too quickly, causing constant coughing at night. Moss was pleasant and warm, but it required thorough and lengthy drying. Otherwise, the heat of the human body could cause it to mold right inside the mattress. The most expensive option was down and feathers. They were collected over many years, filling the ticking little by little. Such a mattress became a real treasure and was often included in a bride's dowry, symbolizing care and prosperity. Down feather beds were incredibly soft, retained heat, and allowed a person to literally sink into a soft cloud-like mass. In cold winters, such a feather bed was a real salvation, but in summer it became torture, retaining too much heat. Therefore, they were stored in a chest until the cold months arrived. Sometimes a combination option was used in huts, where a hard straw mattress served as the bottom layer, and a feather bed was placed on top for softness. To prevent the sharp tips of the feathers from poking through, the inner surface of the ticking was rubbed with soap or wax. This took time and effort, but the result made sleeping truly comfortable. Sometimes sheep's wool was used as a filler if the family owned a large flock. Wool mattresses were elastic, retained their shape better than straw, and retained heat perfectly. However, the wool had to be carefully prepared, washed in hot water, combed to remove debris, and dried in the sun. Any residual moisture could cause the mattress to rot from the inside, and the smell would become unbearable. Therefore, women on the frontier paid special attention to mattresses, understanding that good sleep was vital for people who did hard work every day. Bed care became a constant and mandatory task. Sleeping on a freshly stuffed mattress was like sleeping on a small hill. Sometimes people had to literally climb onto it, leaning on the frame. After a few weeks, the mattress began to settle, taking the shape of a person's body and forming a cozy hollow in which it was pleasant to hide from the cold. The smell of dry grass, corn, or wool filled the house with natural freshness, creating a special atmosphere familiar to every settler. These simple materials, gifted by nature, provided amazing comfort at minimal cost. Like this, if you also think that natural materials are better than synthetics, what if everything you've been taught about personal space is outdated? In those days, ideas about personal space were completely different because life dictated its own terms. People lived in cramped conditions, not because they liked it, but because it was impossible to survive on the frontier otherwise. Large families settled in small houses where every corner was used to its fullest. They had to share their modest possessions, not only with relatives, but also with the necessary supplies for the winter. All space was perceived as shared, and people got used to this from an early age. In cramped one-room huts, there was a catastrophic lack of space for all members of a large family. Small buildings were constructed from available materials, so walls were rarely made wide and rooms were not spacious. The most important things were the speed of construction and the ability of the house to retain heat in harsh weather. When a family had 5 or 8 members, cramped conditions became the norm. People were constantly bumping elbows and sharing small areas of floor space. Such living conditions became a natural part of life, even though they caused constant discomfort. The solution to the problem was to use the space under the roof, which was called a loft or attic. This corner became an important aid, as it freed up the main floor for adults and housework. Often, it was the attic that saved the family from feeling completely cramped. It made it possible to distribute everyone so that they would not disturb each other, at least at night. Access to it was made as easy as possible so that it could be used all year round. Over time, it became a familiar part of everyday life, without which it was difficult to imagine daily life. It was the realm of the younger generation, where everyone who could climb the stairs on their own was sent to sleep. Children felt a special freedom here, as adults rarely went upstairs unless absolutely necessary. Each child had their own small space, even if it was just a small part of the floor. This is where games, quiet conversations, and the first independent nights away from parental attention were born. The attic became a kind of refuge where the noise of adult life seemed far away. It was there that children learned to get along with each other and share space. The ladder was often just a row of pegs driven into the wall or a rough extension structure. Such structures were not always safe, but they allowed you to climb upstairs somehow. Over time, the wooden supports became loose and had to be repaired by hand. Sometimes the ladder was replaced with a more stable one, but more often than not, it was left as it was due to a lack of materials. It required dexterity and caution, especially from small children. Despite its simplicity, this ladder became an important part of the daily routine. It was necessary to climb it with caution, especially in the dark, so as not to fall down. In the evening, there was almost no lighting, and people used only the dim light from the hearth. One awkward move could lead to a fall, so every step had to be thought out in advance. Children quickly learned to move around in such conditions, developing agility and attentiveness. Sometimes someone would still slip, but this was treated as an inevitable part of everyday life. Caution became an important habit that preserved health. The ceiling in the loft was low and sloping, and an adult could only move around there by bending over or crawling on all fours. Such a confined space affected people's senses, forcing them to move slowly and carefully. The low beams could hit your head, so it was important to remember every bump. Children, being shorter, felt freer and could play without fear of being hit. But for adults, the attic remained a place where they only went when necessary. The space dictated the rules of behavior for everyone who entered it. The heat from the hearth below rose upward, making the attic the warmest place in the house in winter. This warmth brought a feeling of comfort that was so lacking in the cold frontier. That is why children often like to spend their evenings there, warming up after long, cold days. However, this particular feature of heat distribution made the attic too stuffy. In a confined space, heat accumulated and remained inside. This created a large difference in conditions between seasons. However, this same feature made it unbearably stuffy and hot in the summer months. In the heat, the air became stagnant, and it was difficult to breathe. Sleepers were warmed not by blankets, but by the structure of the house itself. People often woke up in a sweat and tried to sleep at the very edge of the floor, where the air was slightly cooler. Many children tried to fall asleep before the intense heat set in, but this was not always possible. Summer nights became a real challenge. There was virtually no ventilation, and the air stagnated, becoming heavy. Sometimes small holes were made in the roof, but they did little to help. The air moved slowly, and even a light breeze at night rarely penetrated upstairs. The smells of soot, dust, and dampness mixed together, creating a thick atmosphere. People got used to it, although at first it caused great discomfort. The attic space retained all the heat of the day, which had nowhere to go. The attic floor was often just a platform of poles, through the cracks of which you could see what was happening below. This gave the dwelling a sense of community, as if there were no boundaries between the floors. Light fell through the cracks and shadows moved across the boards, creating bizarre patterns. Sometimes dust fell from the floor, and it had to be constantly shaken off. This arrangement made the house noisier, but it saved the family from feeling isolated. The attic seemed to live together with the lower floor. This created a peculiar acoustics. Every whisper, every sound from below could be heard upstairs. People in the attic could find out what the adults were doing just by listening. Sometimes it interfered with sleep, especially when the adults lingered by the hearth. But the children often found entertainment in this, making up stories based on the sounds coming from below. The noises became part of nightlife, familiar and inevitable. Such transparency of sound made the house a single organism. There was no privacy, but the presence of family was always felt. This gave a sense of security, especially on long winter nights when the winds howled outside the window. People knew that those they could trust were nearby. The lack of personal space was compensated for by strong family ties. Everyone had to take into account the interests of others, which fostered patience and mutual assistance. Such closeness laid the foundations of character. Sleeping places were arranged right on the floor, spreading out skins or straw mattresses. These simple beds served for many years, sometimes being resewn and restuffed. Straw could be prickly or quickly become crushed, but there was rarely any other choice. Skins provided warmth and softness, especially in the cold. The shared sleeping space became a symbol of family unity. Children fell asleep side by side, feeling close to each other. Nevertheless, for many generations who grew up on the frontier, the attic remained in their memory as a place of the sweetest dreams. It was a symbol of a carefree childhood that remained in their hearts for a lifetime. Even years later, people remembered the soft warmth under the roof and quiet conversations in the dark. The attic became a repository for the most vivid feelings. It connected people to their roots and history. How did they cope with the terrible cold that penetrated even the warmest blankets?
Trade for more in town tomorrow.
Fighting the cold was the main task every night during the winter. The walls of log houses, no matter how thick they were, froze through during severe frosts. The fire in the fireplace inevitably burned out by morning, and the temperature in the room dropped rapidly. To avoid freezing to death, people used various tricks to keep warm in bed. One of the most common practices was to use heated objects. In the evening, large flat stones, bricks, or even cast iron irons were heated by the hearth. These objects were wrapped in several layers of flannel or old woolen fabric to prevent burns. This improvised heater was placed at the foot of the bed under the blanket sometime before bedtime. The stones slowly gave off heat, creating a comfortable temperature at the bottom of the bed. This simple device allowed people to warm up the icy sheets and relax their feet, which had grown cold during the day. Sleepwear was also different from modern clothing. Nightshirts were made of thick flannel or baize. A nightcap was a must-have accessory for both men and women. The head was the only part of the body not covered by a blanket, and a lot of heat escaped through it. A long cap could be pulled over the ears or even the eyes to protect against drafts. Thick knitted socks were worn on the feet, often not taken off for several days. In winter, linen bedding was replaced with flannel, which was warmer to the touch. Heavy blankets, skins, and old clothes were piled on top, and the bed could be quite heavy. The weight of the blankets created a kind of cocoon in which the air was heated by the body and did not escape. If there were not enough blankets, they even put carpets or outer clothing, coats and fur coats on top. The main goal was to create the thickest possible layer between the body and the icy air in the room. They slept huddled together, using the principle of bundling or simply sleeping together. The warmth of the human body was the most reliable and safest source of heat. Often, dogs were even placed at their feet to serve as living hot water bottles. In the morning, climbing out from under such a pile of warm things into a cold room was a real test of willpower. Breath turned into steam, and the water in the bucket was covered with a crust of ice, reminding them that winter still reigned outside. The use of copper hot water bottles with coals was only available to wealthier families with connections to the city. Smoldering coals were poured into such a hot water bottle with a long handle and carried between the sheets. It was a fire hazard, but it had a quick and powerful effect, drying the bed from dampness. But for most pioneers, a regular river rock remained the only available source of additional heat. These methods were passed down from generation to generation, forming the basis of survival in the harsh climate. Are you ready to learn the truth about how those who had no roof over their heads slept? Cowboys, trappers, and gold prospectors spent most of their lives under the open sky. Their bed was the prairie ground, and their bedroom was the endless horizon. The main element of their equipment was a suggan, a thick quilted blanket, often homemade. But the basis of their sleeping place was a tarpaulin, impregnated with oil or fat for waterproofing. This piece of canvas, about 4 to 5 meters long, was called a tarpaulin and was the vagabond's most valuable possession. The technique for laying it out was simple. Half of the canvas was spread on the ground and blankets were placed on top. The person lay down on the blankets and covered themselves with the second half of the tarpaulin, tucking it in at the sides. The result was a kind of waterproof envelope that protected against rain, wind, and snow. Such a cocoon retained body heat much more effectively than just a blanket. A saddle was invariably used as a pillow, placed at the head of the bed. This also had a practical purpose. A saddle was an expensive item, and sleeping on it meant protecting it from theft. In addition, the hard leather of the saddle provided at least some support for the head. Clothes were not usually taken off at night. Only the collar was unbuttoned and the belt loosened. Boots were often left on, especially in cold weather or when there was a danger of sudden attack. If the boots were taken off, they were always hidden under a tarpaulin so that they would not get wet from dew or rain. Putting on wet leather boots that had stiffened in the frost in the morning was a painful procedure. Trappers in the mountains used the skins of hunted animals for sleeping, with bison skins being particularly prized. Bison wool was thick and warm, providing excellent insulation from the frozen ground. However, these skins were heavy and emitted a pungent odor when wet. Sleeping in the wild required constant vigilance, so they slept lightly, waking up at every rustle. The campfire was often extinguished at night or left to smolder in a pit, so as not to attract the attention of enemies. When it rained, they had to build a shelter from the same tarpaulin or look for natural shelter under rocks. The main enemy was dampness coming from below, so they chose a place to sleep on high ground. The art of choosing a dry and wind-protected place was valued more highly than the ability to shoot accurately. In the morning, the entire bedding was rolled up into a compact roll, which was tied to the saddle or placed in the wagon. This roll, or bedroll, was the cowboy's home, which he carried with him everywhere. It stored not only bedding, but also personal belongings, letters, and spare clothes. Losing your bedroll meant being defenseless against the elements. In the next chapter, you will learn how women turned old rags into works of art that saved lives. A patchwork quilt, or quilting, was not just a household item, but a true symbol of the frontier era. Fabric in those days was an expensive and scarce commodity that could not simply be thrown away. Every scrap, every piece of a worn-out shirt or dress was carefully stored in a special bag. When enough material had been accumulated, women would start making a quilt, sewing the pieces together into geometric patterns. These quilts were heavy, dense, and incredibly warm thanks to their multi-layered construction. Inside, between the top decorative layer and the lining, a layer of batting, old wool, or cotton was inserted. All 3 layers were quilted with thousands of small stitches to keep the filling from shifting. It was a colossal task that required hundreds of hours of patience and straining one's eyes by candlelight. Each stitch had to be even and strong so that the quilt would last for decades. The patterns on the quilts had their own names: log cabin, bear's paw, drunkard's path. They often reflected the realities of the pioneers' lives, their hopes and fears. The quilt became a kind of family chronicle because you could recognize a piece of a wedding dress or a child's shirt in it. Looking at the scraps, a woman could remember the entire history of her family, everyone who had worn these clothes. This gave the item special emotional value. To make quilts, women often gathered together for so-called quilting bees. This was one of the few social activities available to women on isolated farms. While working, they socialized, shared news, and supported each other. Working together allowed them to finish a large quilt much faster than they could alone. The finished product often became a gift for a wedding or the birth of a child. These quilts were incredibly functional. They served not only as blankets, but also as room dividers. They were hung on doors and windows to protect against drafts and retain heat. In wagons, they were used to cover gaps, creating a cozy space for children. Worn-out blankets were not thrown away, but used as bedding for animals or stuffing for new mattresses. The life cycle of fabric on the frontier was endless. The patchwork quilt was a symbol of thrift and creativity in harsh conditions. It added bright colors to the gray and monotonous interior of a log cabin. Even in the poorest homes, where there was no other furniture, there was always a colorful quilt on the bed. It was the banner of the family hearth, which the family carried with them to new lands. The issue of ventilation in log cabins was solved in a paradoxical way. On the one hand, the houses were full of cracks through which the wind constantly blew. On the other hand, there was a strong belief that night air was harmful and carried disease. Therefore, at night, the doors and shutters, if there were any, were closed tightly and secured with bolts. People tried to isolate themselves from the outside environment as much as possible, fearing not only the cold, but also miasmas. As a result, by morning, the air inside the small hut became heavy and stale. The smells of cooking, unwashed bodies, drying clothes, and smoke mixed into a thick cocktail. Even with good draft, the fireplace still smoked a little inside the room, adding carbon monoxide. Soot settled on the walls, furniture, and faces of those sleeping, permeating everything around. Constant inhalation of smoke led to respiratory diseases, which were the scourge of the time. The windows in early huts were often covered with oiled paper or animal skins rather than glass. Such material allowed some light to pass through, but did not allow air to pass through at all. It was impossible to open such a window for ventilation without damaging the structure. Only in summer could the door be left ajar, covering the opening with a cloth to protect against insects. But in winter, airtightness was synonymous with survival. The cramped quarters contributed to the rapid spread of infections. If one person got sick, everyone got sick. The cough of one family member kept the rest awake, echoing throughout the small house. Moisture from the breath of many people condensed on the cold walls and ceiling, promoting the growth of mold. They tried to dry out this dampness by heating the hearth, but the heat was distributed unevenly. It was hot by the fire, but in the far corners, water froze in buckets. People got used to the lack of oxygen and high concentration of carbon dioxide while they slept. In the morning, the first thing they did was open the door wide to let in the fresh, frosty air. This ventilation ritual was as essential as prayer or breakfast. Stepping out onto the porch and breathing in the clean prairie air was a real pleasure, but at night, fear of the darkness and cold outside forced them to seal up their homes again. Social norms at the time did not encourage frequent bathing, which also affected the atmosphere in the bedroom. The smell of sweat was considered a natural and inevitable companion to hard work. Aromatic herbs hung from the ceiling slightly masked the heavy smell. Mint, sage, and lavender served not only as seasonings but also as natural air fresheners. Despite the stuffiness, the hut seemed like the safest place on earth. Hospitality on the frontier was not just a matter of politeness, but a law of survival. People understood that in the harsh conditions of the desert or dense forests, a lone traveler could easily perish without shelter. The weather often changed rapidly, and even a short storm could be deadly for someone left out in the open. Therefore, helping a stranger was a matter of honor, regardless of who stood at the door. In this way, a unique culture of mutual support was formed. It helped to preserve humanity even where life was extremely difficult. Refusing to give a traveler a place to stay for the night was considered a grave sin and could doom a person to death. This rule was passed down from generation to generation and was observed as strictly as religious commandments. People knew that one day they themselves could find themselves in the place of a stranger. Therefore, the doors of their homes remained open to anyone who needed shelter for the night. Neighbors often recalled instances when their own lives depended on the hospitality of another family. This strengthened not only mutual aid, but also trust within small settlements. When someone knocked on the door at night, the owners were obliged to let the stranger in, whoever he was. Fear of possible danger gave way to obligations to the common rules of survival. The owners usually greeted the guest with caution, but politely, observing his behavior and manners. This helped them understand how safe the stranger was without breaking with tradition. Inside the hut, there was already an established order, and the newcomer had to adapt to it. The main thing was to give the traveler a night of warmth and safety. However, there were no extra beds in the cramped huts, and accommodating a guest became a challenge. There was so little space that each additional person required a rearrangement of the entire nighttime routine. People moved their beds, freeing up a little more space by the hearth. Sometimes it was necessary to remove utensils or baskets with supplies to give the guest at least a little comfort. Such preparations took time, but no one complained. After all, it was an inevitable part of neighborly solidarity. The traveler was usually offered a place on the floor by the hearth, the warmest and most honorable place after the host's bed. The warmth of the fire protected against the cold, which easily penetrated the thin walls. This place was considered a sign of respect and recognition of the difficulties of travel. For the guest, it was a real salvation because the night could be freezing. Sometimes the hosts themselves moved further away, giving the stranger more warmth. Such behavior emphasized the high value of mutual assistance. The guest was given a blanket or a skin, if possible, or he used his own cloak. Any additional protection from the cold was important because the nights on the frontier were harsh. Sometimes the hosts sacrificed their own warmth so that the stranger could rest well before continuing on his journey. Heavy winter skins were stored for years and passed down from generation to generation, so they were treated with care. The guest always perceived such care as a special honor. His gratitude was expressed in quiet words and modest behavior. Often the floor was so densely covered with sleeping people that it was impossible to walk at night without stepping on someone. People slept literally shoulder to shoulder, sharing the space as best they could. They had to move slowly and carefully so as not to disturb the others. In such cramped quarters, everyone knew that any movement could wake up the whole room. But such inconveniences were taken for granted. They were a normal part of communal living. People lay in rows, their feet toward the fire, like rays of sunlight spreading out from the center. This arrangement allowed everyone to get a little warmth, especially in winter. The feet warmed up first, which helped maintain overall body heat. Everything happened so routinely that even small children knew exactly where to lie down. Such nights created a sense of community and security. The warm circle around the hearth became a symbol of survival. This was called sleeping in a fan formation and allowed everyone to get their share of warmth. This practice was widespread throughout the frontier, regardless of region. People knew that only through joint efforts could they survive in the cold. Even strangers became part of this common circle. At such moments, the differences between people disappeared completely. All that remained was the simple human need for warmth. People felt no embarrassment at such closeness with strangers. Necessity dictated its own rules. Questions about personal space took a back seat, giving way to the basic instinct of survival. Everyone understood that there was no other way to get through the winter. People lived so closely together that they no longer noticed the awkwardness. Over time, such nights became an occasion for peaceful conversations and the exchange of news. This is how a relaxed atmosphere was formed. But it was precisely this willingness to squeeze together and share warmth that made life on the frontier possible. People knew that without such mutual support, no one would be able to survive in the harsh environment. Hospitality became not just a tradition, but the foundation of the entire settler society. It helped maintain connections and foster a sense of unity. Even the smallest gestures of kindness could save a life. That is why the custom of hospitality lived on so long and so strongly. By the end of the 19th century, the situation with sleeping on the frontier began to change dramatically. Railroads brought goods from industrial centers, and catalogs appeared in homes. The Sears, Roebuck and Comer catalog became a veritable Bible for settlers, offering goods never before seen. One of the most coveted purchases was a factory-made iron bed. It symbolized the end of the era of homemade furniture and the transition to civilized life. Iron beds had a huge advantage over wooden ones. They had fewer crevices for dirt and dust to accumulate. Metal was easy to clean, durable, and looked modern and elegant. Open-work backs covered with enamel became the main decoration of the interior, the pride of the hostess. Along with the beds came factory-made spring mattresses, which did not need to be fluffed up every morning. This was an incredible leap in comfort that people could only dream of before. Bed linen also became more affordable and varied thanks to factory production of fabric. White cotton sheets that could be boiled began to replace coarse, homespun cloth. Real cotton quilts appeared, light and warm, replacing heavy skins. People began to divide their homes into rooms, setting aside separate bedrooms for parents and children. The concept of privacy finally began to enter the daily lives of farmers. Hygiene also improved. With the advent of metal beds, it became easier to keep the bedroom clean. The air became fresher as new houses were built with large windows that could be opened. Fear of the night air gradually receded under the pressure of scientific knowledge and common sense. Sleep ceased to be just a way to restore strength for survival. It became part of a comfortable rest. However, the old patchwork quilts did not disappear. They became family heirlooms. They were carefully stored in chests and taken out on holidays or on particularly cold nights. The memory of how their ancestors slept on earthen floors and corn mattresses was passed on to children as a lesson in resilience. The iron bed in the corner of the spacious bedroom became a monument to man's victory over the wilderness. The frontier era was coming to an end, giving way to a new, more comfortable, but perhaps less heroic life. We have come a long way from the cold ground under the wheels of a wagon to the shiny nickel-plated headboard from a catalog. The history of sleep on the frontier is a story of incredible adaptation and human ingenuity. They used grass, leaves, stones, and scraps of fabric to create living conditions where survival seemed impossible. Every peaceful night was a small victory over the harsh climate and circumstances. The comforts we take for granted today were a lifelong goal for them, achieved through years of hard work. Their experience reminds us how little a person really needs and how much they can create from nothing. Do you think you could survive even one night on a corn mattress in a freezing hut? Suggest topics for future videos about the lives of pioneers that interest you in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel.